The presuppositional nature of the state allows it to do things that, if a firm were to do it, would be considered extreme abuse and elicit a boycott and war response. When a state is revealed as a firm, that is, by whatever intellectual mechanism the fog of presupposed authority is lifted, the result is the boycott and war response, though it is usually called a revolution. Unfortunately, throughout history, revolutions typically consist of one presupposed authority displacing another. That is to say, they replace one state with another. Thus, the term revolution is appropriate. It is not meaningful change, just a revolving of the guard, a revolution. I am not for a revolution. I am for smashing of presupposed authorities. That is, to smash the state entirely and corporations to the extent that they are disintegrated from the structure of production. In 2009, U.S. government at federal, state, and local spending and the effects of inflation was supposedly 46.22% of GDP. A little less than half of GDP. This means that 46.22% of the resources in the U.S. economy went to the state. It doesn't matter if the funds were explicitly taxed or the money was printed. Printing money provides the state with more bills, but since there are more bills floating around as a result, the value of each bill becomes less. And so it doesn't matter how high the income tax is, which is why Republicans calling for deficit spending for tax cuts is just silly. If the state spends the money, it was taxed in one way or another. A recession is what happens when resources are misallocated according to the demands of society. I explained earlier how and why this happens. The collapse of the state will just be a big recession. For some context, let's look at the Great Depression, in which annual average real GDP supposedly contracted by 8.6, 6.4, and 13.0 in 1930, 31, and 32 respectively. This compounds to 25.5%. I'm not adding them up, I'm compounding them from 1930. I'm compounding the loss from year 1930, 1931, and 1932. Added up, it's actually a little bit higher than 25.5%, but because the 1931 GDP was lower than the 1930 GDP, a 6.4% decline in the 1931 GDP would not be the same as a 6.4% decline in the 1930 GDP, and since I'm basing this all off of the 1930 GDP, it compounds to less than the adding up of all those numbers. Anyway, supposedly once Roosevelt implemented the New Deal, growth recovered, but this is spurious given that the growth was fiat. Right? It is similar to how the U.S. GDP supposedly skyrocketed in World War II and contracted by 11% following the war. The GDP didn't skyrocket in World War II and didn't plummet following the war. The bean counter simply ignored subjective value and looked at dollars being spent on stuff. Same with the New Deal, which, like the war, was a massive amount of government spending which the bean counters assumed was all value. Right? It's like a school. Say government spends $1 million on a school. Has $1 million of value been provided by that school? Necessarily not. But according to the GDP stats, it registers at $1 million in the same way people buying $1 million of something that they choose to buy, that they actually, by their actions, value at $1 million does. The difference is that people buying the clothing value that clothing more than $1 million, right? Because they get some consumer surplus. Whereas the school is necessarily valued less than the funds spent on it, which is why they have to be taxed. If it was valued more than the funds spent on it, then it wouldn't need to be taxed. But people pay their taxes because of the presupposed legitimacy of the state. World War II and the New Deal can thus be seen as sham growth. Now, between 1930 and 1940, the state never reached 23% of GDP. And so the market was relatively free enough from taxation to go through the recession despite the New Deal spend-a-thon. And so there was a New Deal, and there was a recovery in terms of subjective valuation, though not as much as the numbers would indicate, but it was all in spite of the New Deal. Resources were seized from the population to build those dams and paint those murals. This cannot create wealth as determined by people's subjective valuations. It can only seize real resources and convert them into disintegrated state programs and projects. Deficit spending causes these resources to be seized via the inflation tax. But let us assume that GDP did contract by 25.5% between 1930 and 1932. If the state were to collapse in the U.S. in 2010, right, I'm not saying it will, but let's just pretend it does, that would certainly result in a GDP contraction of 46.22%, but probably more, though I cannot quantify how much. The reason I say that the failure of the firm called state will cause a contraction greater than 46.22% is because barriers to entry maintained by the presupposition of the authority of the firm called state allow corporations to misallocate resources. And I don't want to go into specifics of how corporations misallocate resources, but the reader can probably think of some. So it will be the biggest recession the U.S. has ever faced. Not only the entire state, right, which is 46% of GDP, but also a massive restructuring of all the firms that are that exist in their current incarnation because of state protection, barriers to entry. But on the flip side of recession is the reintegration of resources. All those government employees will now lack a job, but since firms now pay zero taxes, they will be able to hire more workers. As for welfare, there will be some fallout, but since the productive class now pays zero taxes, they will have more expendable income. In my mind's eye, I see this as a plant, right? This plant is half true and half cancer, though not evenly split. Parts of the plant are more true and parts are more cancerous, right? Even a state program provides some value, and so there's no organelle of the plant that is completely cancerous. The cancer is identified and the cancer dies. This cancerous material, these cancerous cells, is then digested by the true plant, causing rapid growth for the true plant, the integrated structure of production, though immediately not to the same size as it was when the cancer made up half of the total plant's size. I see it as the total size of the plant contracts by 50% by digesting the cancer, right, because the cancer was 50%, but then the plant grows by 20% by being able to reintegrate the formerly cancerous proteins and lipids, right, at reduced pay, of course. This is not to say that all the people will die, but that the firm and the state and all of its franchises will die in an institutional sense. But now that the plant has removed the cancer, even though it is smaller, it is freer. And even though the formerly cancerous lipids and proteins are being paid less, each unit of money, whatever it is now worth more because the true plant, integrated structure of production, has grown by 20%. And now the plant will grow faster than ever. And when it reaches the size it was before the recession, the standard of living will be worlds better than it was just before the Great Recession, or the collapse of the state.